So what do you do when you lose something? Do you retrace your steps, go back to all the places you were last time you saw it, go from room to room? Science has actually proven that when you go through a doorway, there's like literally a switch that flips in your mind and you forget the thing that you were just thinking about. But when you go back through that same doorway, it flips it back on so you remember. So that's one of the ways that we can go about finding things is going back where we were and we remember, oh yeah, that's where I left that. But what do you do if that doesn't work? Do you call for help? Kids, everybody, come help me find my keys, my wallet, my phone. Those are the things most often lost at my house. I don't know about yours. And we just search everywhere and get the whole team together. But what if that doesn't work? Do you give up? Do you panic? Do you pray? That's good. So what if it's something that's really valuable? What do you do if you can't find something that's really valuable? You don't give up, do you? You do whatever it takes. You leave no rock or couch cushion unturned in search of that thing that's really valuable, which is why unclaimedbaggage.com is so weird to me. So since 1970, Unclaimed Baggage has been a company in Alabama that has bought unclaimed luggage from airlines and resold, repurposed, or recycled those things. And so as you can imagine, as airlines get bags that are left behind, a lot of it's just like normal, benign stuff, lots of clothing, lots of electronics get left behind. But they found some really weird stuff too. Like they found a camera that was from one of the space shuttles. That was pretty weird. They also found a missile guidance system from a fighter jet. They gave that back to the Air Force. They found a whole suitcase full of fake body parts from the Saw movie franchise. That would be a terrifying find, wouldn't it? And they also found a Halloween card from the 1980s that was signed by Richard Nixon. So didn't know there's Halloween cards, and I don't know why he signed it, but they found it. And so they auctioned that off. And so they found some weird stuff, but they also found some really valuable stuff. Like they found a Cartier watch that was appraised at $26,000. They found a pair of Louis Vuitton Nike Air Force One sneakers, imagine this, worth $12,000. And they found a diamond gold, 14-karat gold ring that was appraised at over $37,000. Now, I don't know about you, but I think if I lost any of those last things, I would have done whatever it took to find that and reclaim it. All right, so what do you do when you lose something? Now, and those are just things. What do you do if you lose something that's alive? That's a person. What do you do then? Today we're going to be back in Matthew chapter 18. And so if you want to turn there with me, we're going to be reading here in just a minute. And as we go back there, what we're going to do is we're actually going to read the parts that I skipped over last week. So we read kind of the beginning part where Jesus talked about having faith like a child. And then we jumped ahead to chapter 19 and read what he did when people brought children to him to be blessed. But I want to read the part in between that. And in it, Jesus is going to give us some advice on what to do when we lose someone. And so he says this, Matthew 18, starting at verse 10. See to it that you don't despise one of these little ones, because I tell you that in heaven their angels continually view the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If someone has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, wouldn't he leave the 99 on the hillside and go and search for the stray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over that sheep more than over the 99 that did not go astray. In the same way, it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. And so Jesus brings back for us a term that we looked at last week that was little ones. And it started out, he was talking particularly about actual children. And then we found out that he was talking a little bit beyond that. He was talking about anyone who's a follower of him. And today he even expands that a little bit more because in some manuscripts there's a verse in there where he says, I want us to find those little ones, those lost ones that I'm looking for. And over in Luke chapter 15, he shares a similar parable where he says that heaven will rejoice over the repentance of one sinner more than 99 people who don't need to be saved. And so he expands little ones to really be anyone that is his creation, his people, that he desires for them to be saved. And so he says that what should we do if we ever find one of those little ones is lost? He says we should go after them and care for them just like we would for a sheep under our care. Now, at my house, we've got two indoor dogs, two pugs, Otis and Poppy. And we've had them, I think, about 4 years now. And they are cute and adorable and ridiculous. And my kids love them. and they're great, and they live indoors, and then we let them out in the fenced-in yard right around our house, and they do great there. They live there, and it's wonderful, except for a couple months ago, my wife gets hold of me and says, Otis is missing. He's gotten out of the yard, and I don't know where he went. And so they began frantically driving around because they didn't know which direction he went. About the same time, someone from church actually sends me a message on Facebook and says, hey, I saw this on Facebook. Is this your pug? And there he is. Where is he at? There he is. This sweet baby was found over past the middle school area. If you know his owner, let me know. That's Otis. He had gotten out and he ran into town. And someone picked him up. He jumped right in their car because he loves everybody. And by the time I got all the pieces connected, they actually dropped him off at a shelter. And so we called the shelter, and it's a big deal. But we finally met up with the people and got our little Otis back. And we rejoiced, just like Jesus said we would when we find that one lost one that got away. But you know what else? I was a little irritated at Otis, right? I mean, did you see how happy he looks to be on an adventure? And how much stress he gave us? He didn't care. And he knows better than to get out of the yard. And if he does get out of the yard, why would he run away he just took off. Why would he do that? And so you know what? As much as I rejoice, I also had to forgive Otis for doing something kind of stupid, right? And Jesus here, is telling us that his desire for the little ones, and I just want you to make sure that you know that you're one of those little ones, is that we wouldn't perish, that we wouldn't be lost, that we'd be found, that our relationship with God would be restored. But you know what it's going to take to get there? It's going to take some forgiveness. Now, as we're sitting here and thinking about this, and we're talking about that, you may be wondering, so what does that have to do with us knowing greater love and showing greater love and being greater servants? Well, the fact is that all our relationships are interconnected. So my relationship with God is directly connected to my relationship with other people. And so my vertical relationship with my Creator and my relationship horizontally with other people are all connected. And so we first have to understand God's love and God's forgiveness of us in order to understand love and forgiveness of other people. And so because of that, here Jesus is talking first and foremost about our salvation, our relationship with Him being restored, us being found from our sin and our lostness and our brokenness and being made right and have a restored relationship with Him. But then he immediately, next phrase, begins talking about what we do when we have broken relationships with other people. So let's read on here, verse 15. He says this, if your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he won't listen, take one or two others with you, so that by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be established. If he doesn't pay attention to them, tell the church, and if he doesn't pay attention even to the church, let him be like a Gentile and a tax collector to you, cut off from your fellowship. Now, we've all been hurt in here, haven't we? At some point in your life, you've been hurt by somebody. And the other side of that is true, is probably we've all hurt somebody. Somewhere in our life, we've hurt other people. So the question is, what do we do when there's hurts between us? I think, unfortunately, a lot of times we treat it like unclaimed baggage and we just try to forget about it, ignore it, avoid it, and we don't do anything. But Jesus is here saying relationships are important. They're valuable. They're worth the hard work of restoring. And so then he kind of explains to us what that might look like. He says, so if someone has something against you, and the other side of that is if you have something against someone else, so it doesn't matter really which way that is. Over in Matthew 5, he talks about that if you know someone has something against you, you also are responsible to do something about it. So whether you're offended or the offender, then you have a responsibility, it says, to go to that person and try to make it right. And just keep that between you and them. Just don't talk to anybody else. Don't pass go. Don't go anywhere else. Just go straight to them and talk to them about the issue. But then he says, but if they don't respond, if that doesn't go well, then invite 2 or 3 trusted spiritual friends who care about both of you to help you maybe sort this out. So bring them in kind of as a mediator. And he says, and if that doesn't work, then I want you to bring the church in. And usually what that means is, involving some church leadership to maybe help you sort this out, to kind of give you some direction, talk this thing through. But then he says, and if that doesn't go well, I want you to treat them like an unbeliever, is basically what he says. Now that might sound a little bit harsh, and what this section is what is traditionally known as this church discipline. What do we do if there's someone who is continually in unrepentant sinful behavior? What do we do? And so this is the procedure, and it may sound harsh, And it may even sound like the opposite of the forgiveness that we're talking about today, because the opposite of forgiveness is judgment. And that sounds kind of judgy to cut somebody off, doesn't it? But I want us to notice what is going on in this process, because if we point someone's fault out because we want to condemn them, that's one thing. But if we point someone's fault out to them because we want to restore and help them heal and come back out of that situation, that's completely another. The church at Corinth in the first century saw this really well, and they got to see this up close and personal. In his first letter to the Corinthian church, Paul addresses the fact that there was a sinful situation going on in their church that they weren't doing anything about. He says that there was a son who was in an incestuous relationship with his mother. And if you don't know what that means, don't Google it. Okay, I'm just going to warn you. Not going to be where you want to go today. But he says it, and this isn't right, and you need to do something about that. And because these people are unrepentant, Paul gives the church this advice. He says, remove them from your midst and deliver them over to Satan, that their spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. And some of that language sounds really harsh, doesn't it? To remove them, to turn them over to Satan. Who would ever want to say that about somebody? But notice again what the goal was. Why did he say to do that? So that they might be saved. That there might be repentance and restoration and salvation and healing in those relationships. Now, the good news is that by the time Paul writes his second letter to the Corinthians, that exactly is what had happened. Those people that have repented of their sins and they confessed them and they came back to the fellowship, and Paul warns them. They says, now that they've done that, now that we've gotten that goal of them returning from their sins, let's welcome them back. He says, forgive them and comfort them and reaffirm them with your love for them. And so the goal was not to exclude them. The goal was to get them in a place where there could be healing and forgiveness of the things that were between them. And the Corinthian church knew that so well, because they too, when they had confessed and repented of their sins, had found such great healing and forgiveness and restoration from the Lord. And so what we need to understand in Jesus' advice for us about what do we do about lost things, the goal, the point is restoration. But the path is going to be forgiveness. But those things aren't easy, are they? The things we just read, Jesus suggests we do, they're not easy. And even if someone turns around and confesses and repents, it's not easy always to forgive, is it? Corrie ten Boom was a tremendous Christian lady. She lived during World War II, and her sister got thrown into the concentration camps during that time. And she's written several books about her experiences there, and they faced terrible, horrible atrocities at the hands of the German SS. And unfortunately, her sister Betsy lost her life in that concentration camp. But Corrie, actually, because of a clerical error, got released. And as soon as she got released, she knew it was a miracle, and she began going all around Europe and preaching the good news of Jesus Christ and telling people, hey, we don't have to respond with hatred and fear and bitterness. We can respond to all of this with love and grace and mercy. And after the war, she actually got the opportunity to go into Germany and begin telling that same message. And one night she was at a church in Munich, and she was sharing her message. And as she looked out of the crowd, she saw one of the officers, the guards from the concentration camp she'd been kept in, sitting in the crowd. And it just immediately took her off guard. And after the service, everyone was coming up and talking to her, and this man came right up to her. And he says this, he says, how grateful I am for your message, to think, as you say, he has washed my sins away. And Corrie says in that moment, her hands were just frozen. She just froze. And all this anger and frustration and all these feelings just started welling up within her, and she just couldn't get herself to raise her hand to reach to his handshake that he offered. But then God spoke to her in that moment and says, Corrie, I died for that man just like I died for you. Are you going to require more of him? And she asked God to forgive her of her unforgiveness and to give her the strength to forgive him. And she found her hand coming up and shaking that man's hand. And when she did, she said it was like a current went between her and him. And she felt love well up within her for him, because he too was a sinner who needed saved. A little one that was lost that we needed to see forgiveness and restoration for. See, God's great forgiveness goes very far, doesn't it? Now, as Jesus is trying to help everyone understand this, and Peter is there in Matthew 18 trying to get his head around this, he asked Jesus some clarifying questions to make sure he understands what this forgiveness looks like. And in Matthew 18, verse 21, it says this, then Peter approached Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? As many as 7 times? I tell you, says Jesus, not as many as 7, but 70 times 7. Now, in the Jewish culture, a rabbi would teach you that you should forgive somebody 3 times, and that was enough. And so Peter, saying 7 times, thought he was being kind of extravagant. Like he multiplied that times 2, added 1, thought he was good. But Jesus gives him this like absurd number, as if to say, no, Peter, we always forgive. There is no limit to forgiveness. This is something we always must do. And so for us today, and Peter, I'm sure, thought the same thing. So if restoration is the point and forgiveness is the pathway, what does it look like for me to forgive with no limit? And so to help us understand that, Jesus tells another story here. Matthew 18, verse 23. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, one who owed 10,000 talents was brought before him. Since he did not have the money to pay it back, his master commanded that he, his wife, his children, and everything he had be sold to pay the debt. At this, the servant fell face down before him and said, be patient with me, and I'll pay you everything. Then the master of the servant had compassion, released him, and forgave him the loan. Now, in this parable, the master is God, because God is the owner of everything, and we owe him everything. And the servant is us. Now, it says that servant owed him 10,000 talents. Now, a talent was a denomination of money in that day that was worth 20 years of an average worker's wage. So 1 talent is worth 20 years of an average worker's wage. So 20 years of your income is 1 talent. You multiply that times 10,000, and we put that in modern terms. It was as if this man owed his master $6 billion and had to pay it back that day. Now, if you got called to account on $6 billion, would you be able to pay that today? Probably most of us are going to say no, right? And Jesus says this to illustrate to us what a great debt we owe to God because of his forgiveness for us for our sins. Paul puts it most clearly in Romans 6 when he says, the wages, what we've earned from our sin, is death. That's what we've earned. Because none of us can truly pay that back. And so we, just like this man in this parable, have to give our life and our family and everything we are. We have to surrender everything, our whole life, in order to even try to pay that back. We can't do that. It's beyond us. And so Jesus tells us this to help us understand that when we ask for forgiveness, it's a big deal. We oftentimes, I think, don't take sin seriously enough, just like the Corinthian church didn't. That our reckless disobedience and our selfish living is costly for us, for those around us, and for our relationship with God. And it took an enormous act of grace and love for that to be paid for. That God himself had to come down and die in your place in order for that forgiveness to be purchased. And so when we think about our key verse for this whole series and our memory verse for this month, John 15, when Jesus says, no one has greater love than this to lay down his life for his friends, he did that for us first. It's a holy, wonderful act that sets us free from our sin and transforms our humiliation into acceptance. See, you and I have been greatly forgiven. God's salvation is immeasurably great. We can't even put a number to quantify what he's offered us and done for us first. And so if we're going to love and forgive with no limit, we have to first fully focus on God's forgiveness of us. That's where this starts. But then what does that do for how we treat others that either we've hurt or that have hurt us? Well, let's go ahead and see what our really enormously forgiven guy does in our story here, Matthew 18, verse 28. It says, that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him about 100 denarii, a few $1,000s. He grabbed him, started choking him, and said, pay what you owe. At this, his fellow servant fell down and began begging him, be patient with me, and I will pay you back. Notice those are the same words that man had just told the master. But he wasn't willing. Instead, the servant went and threw the other servant into prison until he could pay what was owed. When the other servants saw what had taken place, they were deeply distressed and went and reported to their master everything that had happened. Then after he had summoned him, his master said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And because he was angry, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay everything that was owed. so also my heavenly Father will do to you unless every one of you forgives his brother or sister from your heart. So again, what do we tend to do when there's a brokenness in the relationships in our life? Do we ignore it? Do we try to pretend like it's not there? Do we avoid that person? Oh no, there they are. I'm going to this side of the room today. Do we maybe attack that person? Do we resent that person? Do we demand repayment from that person like the servant did in this story? But Jesus says, if you understand the forgiveness I gave you, you can't live that way. If you know greater love, you've got to show that greater love to other people by forgiving them also. Anything less is hypocritical. And for that matter, anything less is going to leave us all in torment. You know, there's a famous quote that says, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And that tends to be what happens if we don't forgive others as God has forgiven us. Mary Lou McCulley was the wife of a missionary who her husband, along with a few others, including Jim Elliott and Nate Saint, were reaching out to a tribe called the Wadani. And one day the Wadani men came out and killed all 5 of those missionaries in a tragic act. But in a glorious act, all of the families of those men came back into that place and forgave those men and led them all to the Lord. And someone asked Mary Lou one time, like, how she could do that and forgive those men who took her husband's life and the lives of those other missionaries. And she said this, that's what God would ask us to do, and it's what God did for us. Besides, being bitter wasn't going to help me. And maybe the most poignant example I can think of why we should forgive others comes from an example of unforgiveness. Simon Wiesenthal was another person who was captured and put into concentration camps in Germany in World War II. And he shares a story that one day he was out on work detail and he got pulled out, and he didn't know what to expect because all sorts of terrible things had been happening to people. And so he got taken into a building and taken back through hallways and walked into a room. And there in the room lay this very severely injured German officer. And it was obvious that his wounds were mortal and this man was very weakened. And he called Simon over and he began to just confess to Simon all of the atrocities that he had done in the name of the Nazi regime. And it turned out he had asked for the nurse to go find a Jewish person. It's kind of like an act of last rites to be able to just confess his sins. And Simon says he doesn't know how long it lasted, but it felt like hours. And the guy just kept pouring things out. And then at the end, the man in a very feeble voice lifted his arm and grabbed Simon's arm and said, will you please forgive me for what I've done? And Simon said he just stood there in silence for a few moments, and then he walked away and said nothing. And I think the tragedy of that story is this, is that, first of all, that officer did not hear anybody tell him that he forgave him before he died, which was very shortly after that. But the more tragic part is that Simon lived to be almost 100 years old. He survived the concentration camps, got out, and he spent his whole life trying to find those who had caused his pain and make them pay. He was tormented because of unforgiveness for his whole life. Now, for us, what we have to understand, what Jesus is trying to tell us today, is that God's great forgiveness requires that we release the grip of the grudge so that it doesn't own us. And that's not to say that we ignore the hurt or we say that the hurt doesn't matter. We actually have to confront the hurt if we're going to truly find forgiveness. Lewis Smedes, in his book, Forgive and Forget, challenges us to this. It says, to be able to forgive, we must have the guts to look hard at the wrongness, the horridness, the sheer wickedness of what somebody did to us. We cannot camouflage. We cannot excuse. We cannot ignore. We eye the evil face to face, and we call it what it is. See, in order for us to truly seek forgiveness and offer forgiveness, we have to be honest about the hurt and the sin and the brokenness. He goes on to say this, only realists can be forgivers. Self-deception is a lot easier than forgiving, to ignore it, but it has no payoff in healing. And so if we want to find true forgiveness and we want to find true freedom and the things that Jesus is offering us, we've got to practice this. It's what somebody once called spiritual forgetting. It's not that we ignore or forget what's happened, but we decide to take it and deal with it in a spiritual way, which usually involves us not keeping a record or keeping score of the hurts against us because we know we have flaws too. In 1 Corinthians 13, we read a few weeks ago that we should keep no record of wrongs because Jesus no longer keeps a record of ours when we ask for his forgiveness. That we be bigger than the offense, that we seek restoration and healing rather than holding on to bitterness and repayment. And that we harbor no judgmental attitude. Because when we harbor a judgmental attitude, again, who does it hurt? It hurts me because I live in the past rather than looking for the hope of the future that Christ offers me. So how do we do that? Those all sound like great things, but they're not easy things. So how do we do them? Well, again, I think Jesus gives us a great model. And back in Matthew chapter 5, I just want to read a couple verses. They'll be on the screen for you. That gives us a simple, easy model of what we do if we have something against somebody else or we think they have something against us. Jesus says, so if you're offering your gift on the altar and you there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. And so in those two short little verses, Jesus gives us 4 little steps that we can take if we need to deal with an issue of forgiveness. One is stop. Don't do anything else. Don't try to manage anything else. Don't try to deal with anything else until you've dealt with that hurt, with that problem, with that sin, that unforgiveness. And so what do we do to deal with it? We go. And again, it doesn't matter whether you're the one who's hurt or you're the one who did the hurting. He says it's your job, your responsibility to go to that person and try to get it right. And then he says that when you go to them, you reconcile. And what does reconcile mean? It means I own my part. I admit and confess the things I've done wrong and ask for forgiveness, and I admit that I'm willing to forgive the things that were done wrong to me. I own my part. I do what I can. Now, again, this whole process of loving other people and being greater servants, I just want you to know that it doesn't give a direct return on investment. I can't guarantee you what the other person's going to do when you do that. They may not respond well, but you know what we need to do? We need to do what God's called us to do. We need to be obedient to that. Because once we do, it says we return. Because now I'm free from that. I've let that go. I've confessed and I've offered forgiveness and I've let that go. And I can move on with freedom because of Christ's forgiveness of me. Again, that's simple, but it's not easy. But when we do it, we're going to see God do great things. And if you're still sitting here today saying, man, that sounds really hard. I don't know how I can never do that. I just want to remind you that Jesus did that first, and he did that for you. He set the standard, he set the model, and he is the one who first gets to say, blessed are the merciful, for they'll be shown mercy. And he went first in showing you great mercy. He calls you to do the same. And so as we think about being greater servants and showing greater love, would you consider being a like-minded servant to take on the heart of Christ and humbly put others first and offer forgiveness in the areas that need forgiveness? Are you ready to stop living in the uncertainty and panic of the lostness in your life? You know, I know that offering forgiveness is not the natural response to the hurt in our life, but I believe that we can do this supernatural act as we become surrendered people. And so this morning, as we get ready to respond, I just want to ask you, what is it in your life that you need to surrender today in order to either find or offer forgiveness? Maybe for some of us in here today, we need to surrender our sins to God. We need to start at that place where that parable starts. We need to admit that I owe God a great debt because of my disobedience. And that I need him to forgive me. And when we offer that and we ask for that, what we're going to find is a glorious, merciful, forgiving God who says, I've already paid for that. You're forgiven. And maybe for some of us, that's what we need to do in these next few moments. Others of us, maybe we need to surrender our hurts to God. Maybe there's things in your life right now, as we've talked about this, there's hurts in your life that are so huge you don't know what to do with them. You don't even know how to take that first step towards forgiveness. And so I believe what God would tell us to first do is bring that to him and say, God, I want to surrender this to you because I don't know what to do with it, but I trust that you do. Please help me. Just like Corey did. Help me with my forgiveness. Maybe that's what you need to do this morning. Maybe some of us here need to surrender our rights by offering forgiveness to somebody who's hurt us. Let's say, I'm going to be willing to put them first over my rights, and I'm going to offer forgiveness to somebody. And maybe some of us today, we need to surrender our wrongs and confess that we've hurt people and ask them to forgive us. And as we do those things, as we surrender our lives, what we're going to find is the great mercy of God is going to heal us and free us and restore our relationship, not just with him, but with each other. And so this morning, as we sing these last songs, If you need to, come forward and pray. And we'd love to pray with you as you surrender those things. Or if you need to grab some people and deal with some things, grab some people and deal with some things. This morning may be the best morning for some of us to take advantage of the foot washing station. It's a great moment for you to just serve somebody and restore and reconcile some things. We've got those in both the rooms off the west foyer here. So through that door, either side, there's foot washing stations. Maybe this would be a moment for you to do that and to find the restoration that forgiveness gives. Would you guys stand with me?